like a silent alarm that wouldn't go off. I'd always had a feeling that something wasn't quite right with my wife. Once upon a time, Isabel Whitmore was the one who shook my hand and said, "We will conquer the world together." Her eyes had shone as she met mine, and her laughter had reverberated through the entire room. But as time went on, her once warm embrace was replaced by a chill I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with her staying out late, the enigmatic sharpness in her voice when she spoke to me, the way she would avert her gaze mid-conversation, as if I was no longer worth her attention. I rationalized it as stress, a temporary setback. After. All 7 years of marriage had to mean something, right? I was naive to think so. Now I understand just how blind I was, clinging to an ideal version of her that didn't exist anymore. We'd been through some tough times recently, and I carried a lot of that weight on my shoulders. Losing my position at the finance firm hit me hard. One day, I was crunching numbers, feeling like I had a purpose. The next, I was clearing out my desk, avoiding the pity in my coworkers' eyes. It wasn't just the money I lost. It was my confidence, my belief in myself as a provider. Isabel tried to understand at first, but her patience wore thin, fast. Then there was the infertility battle. We had been trying for a baby for years, and every negative test felt like a punch to the gut. The doctors pushed and prodded, ran their tests, and I took the blame, because that's what husbands do, right? I let her relatives whisper behind my back, calling me worthless, while she stood there in silence, never once defending me. I thought we were a team, enduring the storm together. I thought wrong. It all came crashing down on my birthday. That morning, I woke up with a spark of hope. Maybe today would be the day we turned things around. Isabel had been distant, sure, but she had planned something, a meal at a fancy French cafe she loved. I put on my best shirt, the one she used to say made my eyes pop, and let myself imagine her smiling at me again. Maybe she had planned. This to remind us that we still had something worth fighting for. Maybe I'd been overthinking things. I drove to the restaurant, my heart thudding, nervous but eager, like a kid on his first date. When I got there, the hostess escorted me to a separate dining room, and I felt a wave of pride. Isabel had gone all out for me. However, the room was empty. No Isabel, no candles, no romantic setup like I had anticipated, just a table set for one, and a single white envelope. My stomach twisted as I sat down, my hands already shaking as I picked it up. I tore it open, expecting a heartfelt letter, maybe even a clue to some surprise she had in store. Instead, I found a signed divorce agreement. Her name flashed across the page in that flawless, elegant handwriting of hers. Nestled inside was a tiny note. And when I read it, the air fled my lungs. "Happy birthday. Infertile and jobless trash should just leave." I stared at those words, my mind blank, my chest hollow. 7 years. 7 years of late-night talks, shared dreams, quiet mornings with coffee in our kitchen, reduced to this. She didn't just want out. She wanted to bury me. The waiter came in then, his voice smooth and polite, asking if I was ready to order. I looked at the table, the divorce papers sitting there like a cruel centerpiece, and something inside me snapped. Not rage. Not yet. Just a strange, stubborn calm. I told him yes. I would eat. He brought out the food. Isabel must have ordered it ahead of time, perhaps expecting to be here, playing the part of the loving wife before dropping the bomb. I ate every bite. Alone. The clink of my fork against the plate was the only sound in that empty room. And as I chewed, one thought circled in my mind. She had no idea what I was capable of. She thought she had won. But this wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning. I finished the meal, paid the bill with the last of the cash in my wallet, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool against my skin, and for the first time in months, I felt awake. Isabel had drawn a line in the sand, thinking she had built her castle on solid ground. But she didn't know the truth. Not about me, not about herself. Our marriage had been collapsing for a while, but I had been too devoted, too eager to see it for what it was, a house built on sand. And now, the wave was coming. Not from her, from me. She had lit a fire she couldn't put out, and I wasn't going to let it burn me down. I would rise from this, stronger than she ever imagined, and she would rue the day she decided I was trash. Because I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. This was just the start, and I was ready to fight for the life I deserved, with or without her. I was prospering, developing something she'd never touch, and every stride ahead seemed like a silent victory. Meanwhile, Isabel was still floating on her honeymoon phase with Daniel Carter. I'd hear bits and pieces through the grapevine, mutual. Acquaintances who didn't know the complete narrative gently saying how she'd been sighted at some lavish party on Daniel's arm, all smiles and designer clothing. She must have thought she'd hit the lottery, trading me in for a guy with deeper pockets and a louder laugh. I could see her tossing her hair, batting her eyelashes, portraying the perfect girlfriend while Daniel gushed about his latest real estate coup. It didn't disturb me as much as I thought it would. Let her have her time. I knew it wouldn't last. The truth about her infertility was still her little secret, one she hadn't shared with him, and I wasn't ready to be the one to leak it. Daniel's fixation with a legacy was her ticking clock, and I had a front-row ticket to watch it run out. That night, after the conference, I was back at my penthouse, loosening my tie and pouring a glass of whiskey. The city shone outside, all lights and life, and I had landed on top of it for once. My phone buzzed on the counter, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. I almost ignored it. Surely some reporter fishing for a quote, but curiosity grabbed me. I snatched it up, said, "Hello," and froze when I heard her voice. "Isabel, we need to talk," she said, her tone unsteady, nothing like the confident sneer I'd become used to. I stood there, drink in hand, letting the silence stretch out. Part of me wanted to ask what she wanted, to hear her squirm, but a bigger part just didn't care. She'd had her say on my birthday, and I wasn't in the mood for an encore. I hung up without a word, laid the phone down, and took a long sip of my drink. The fire in my throat felt better than anything she could have offered. I leaned against the counter, thinking about how far I'd come. 2 months ago, I'd been eating alone in that private dining room, her divorce papers staring me down. Now I was the person investors toasted to, the one whose name cropped up in tech headlines next to words like pioneer and rising star. Isabel didn't know any of it. She still assumed I was the broken man she'd kicked out racing to survive. She didn't know about the $10 million deal, the startup success, the penthouse I'd paid for in cash. And she sure as hell didn't know Daniel was one of my sponsors, putting his money into my future while she clung to his arm. It was almost hilarious how naive she was to the web she had tangled herself in. I walked to the window, staring out at the skyline, and let my mind wander. What did she want to talk about? Was Daniel starting to ask questions she couldn't answer? Had he realized her stories didn't add up? I'd heard from a friend that he'd been pressuring her about kids lately. Mild statements at first, then more pointed ones. She'd probably dodged them with a chuckle or a distraction, but Daniel wasn't the sort to let it go. He wanted that son, that legacy, and Isabel couldn't give it to him. I could have warned her. Could have informed her months ago when I acquired the specialist's report. But she didn't deserve my mercy. She'd let me carry the disgrace of our empty house, let her relatives humiliate me, all while knowing or not caring that the truth was hers to bear. Now she was drowning in the disaster she'd manufactured, and I wasn't throwing her a lifeline. I drank my whiskey and laid the glass down, feeling a strange kind of tranquility. I didn't need her apologies or her justifications. I didn't need her at all. My life was mine again, better than it had ever been with her, and she couldn't touch it. The conference that day had been proof. I was rising, constructing something meaningful while she followed a fantasy that was already disintegrating. Daniel would figure her out soon enough. Maybe he already had, and when he did, she'd be left with nothing. No mansion, no beautiful vehicles, no spouse to fall back on, merely the debris of her own decisions. I turned off the lights and headed to bed, the city humming below me. Isabel's call stayed in my mind for a minute, but I pushed it aside. She'd made her bed, and I wasn't going to lie in it with her. Let her drown. I had larger things to do tomorrow. Marcus and I were meeting with new prospects, and I had a speech to ready. My world was moving forward, and hers was breaking apart. That was enough for me. 3 months had gone by since Isabel's weak voice crackled through my phone, pleading for a discussion I didn't give her. I'd hung up that night and let her fade into the background, focusing on my own life, my startup, my penthouse, my new rhythm. The days slipped into weeks, then months, and I didn't hear from her again. I believed she'd gotten the hint, or maybe Daniel had kept her too busy to bother me.